Today we will be discussing forms of art, poetry, and memory through the lens of political imprisonment. This is an extensive topic, however we hope to introduce impactful and underrepresented examples of art creation in this presentation. In this presentation, we will talk about how art has been used as a form of resistance, expression, and memory making throughout the world. More specifically, we will closely examine forms of art and memory made in Europe, Africa, South America, and the Middle East. These places exemplify how political prisoners all over the world share a use of art in order to create forms of meaning and power while facing systemic violence.
The first case study I want to look at is that of a political prisoner from Argentina by the name of E. Deborah Benchon. In 1977, Benchon was arrested at the age of 16 years old. She was detained for a total of 4 years and 4 months by Argentine security forces in Devoto prison. In this prison, prisoners were psychologically beaten with the ultimate goal of breaking the prisoner's spirits. Cells were small, 25 square feet, with 4 prisoners in a single cell. They were held in these cells for 19 hours a day and were rotated in and out of different cell blocks in order to stop them from forming relationships with one another. Prisoners were also stripped of their clothing and oftentimes sexually abused. And of course, they were tortured. It was in the face of these hardships that prisoners turned to artistic expression as a form of psychological resistance. Artistic expression took many forms, including drawing, poetry, and other crafts, with Benchon herself focusing on drawing. The creation of art allowed for a separation of the self and the horrors of the daily lives faced inside of the prisons. Restrictions on what materials the prisoners would receive and to what extent artistic expression was allowed varied depending on the year, political climate, as well as the prison. At the worst, prisoners found doing creative work could be tortured or killed. Prisoners were allowed black markers to write letters home to family, which they would use on canvases made out of bed sheets to create their drawings. The finished product would have to be smuggled out by family members. Benchon made 2 primary types of drawings. The first was to express her experiences and emotions with her surroundings, often portraying sadness. The other drawings were more optimistic, representing the outside world and the strength of community and family. Rather than signing artworks themselves, the art would be signed with the date and the prison it was created in order to create a shared sense of community through the shared suffering of all the prisoners. Because relationships and communication were so limited, the prisoners also used art as a form of communication to relate to one another and their lives prior to arrest. In short, creative expression was a necessity for the prisoners, giving them a connection to life.
Another notable example of the importance of art for political prisoners can be seen through the work of Ingi Eflatun. Eflatun was a painter who was born in Cairo in 1924 and lived until 1989. Eflatun was an activist who fought for people who were of low economic status in Egypt. One of her focuses was on the struggles of women in Egypt, since she was a feminist. Eflatun was also a communist, which is what led to her 4-year arrest at the age of 35. This arrest took place secretly, and it also included the arrest of thousands of other political activists who the government determined to be dangerous. Regarding her art, she is known for pieces that highlight the struggles of women's experiences being political prisoners. While she began creating art as a teenager, it became much more prominent in her life during her incarceration, and she has stated that she wanted to use this time to improve her skills. In her art, she focused on depicting women who broke the law, such as thieves, murderers, and prostitutes, because these are the people that she met while in prison. Eflatun also wanted to focus on feelings of isolation that were brought on by political imprisonment. This focus on imprisoned women can be seen in her 1959 portrait titled The Portrait of a Prisoner. In this painting, a mix of bright colors are seen, which helps to draw attention to the image of the woman being depicted. In another piece created in 1961 titled Dreams of the Detainee, a woman is depicted grabbing onto the bars of a prison cell while looking into the distance. This exemplifies the solitude and isolation that Eflatun aimed to show in her artwork depicting political prisoners. The seated position of the woman, along with the muted blue and brown colors of the painting, help to express Eflatun's idea that political imprisonment is an ostracizing experience. The paintings created by Eflatun bring awareness to the existence of women's roles in the political climate of Egypt by depicting the harsh realities of imprisonment, while also being a form of self-expression for Eflatun.
On this slide, we can now move into a more modern-day situation where forms of resistance still exist in major parts of the world. And here we'll be specifically speaking about Russia versus Ukraine. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022, when Russia launched a major assault. Within this time frame, many citizens of both Russia and Ukraine became victims of an ongoing war in which they were both innocent in. Upon the invasion, actions of resistance began to occur on both sides of the continents. Some examples we will be specifically observing now will be the use of social media and how it draws attention to political prisoners, as well as incorporating the use of poems. You can take a look at Denis Pognerboy, who is a Russian journalist that used poetry as a form of protest against the war going on in Ukraine. After leaving Russia, he stayed consistent on his social media platform to post and spread the word of his poems that advocate for political prisoners. I feel like the use of his personal page on social media shows the great evolution of ways that political prisoners can now express themselves and have their voices heard. His poems mourn the millions of innocent people affected by the war and condemned those in power for punishing people for peaceful expression. In one of his poems, he dedicated to Alexandra Soshkolenko, who was an artist that was sentenced to 7 years of prison colony for making supermarket anti-war price tags. There are various poems that he is recognized for, but one of the poems that I want to really incorporate here is stated as 7 years could have killed a person. Raised a daughter, dressed her for school, 7 years. For the papers near the bucket wheat becoming worse than a protocol. This poem critiques how the unjust system treats truth-telling or freedom of speech as a crime. While he wrote many other poems that can also be found on his personal social media account, the popularity they received across the globe, he also became a target. As on January in 2025, he was fined for discrediting the Russian army. This just goes to show how powerful the traditional form of poetry is, but it also shows how as a society we have advanced in finding more forms of communication to repress the limitations that the states and governments wish to place on political prisoners as well as on those who advocate for them. Moving on to the next slide, we are now shifting our focus to Daira Kozlova, who is a 19-year-old Russian activist who became a political prisoner after using poetry and art to also protest the war in Ukraine. Her act of taping a printed excerpt of a poem by the Ukrainian writer Taras Shevchenko onto a monument of him in St. Petersburg, as well as her sharing anti-war messages and her artwork on social media, led for the state of Russia to evaluate this evidence as repeated discreditation of the Russian army. She was then arrested, held almost a year in pretrial detention, and was also forced to a psychiatric evaluation, which is historically used as a tactic by the Russian army to intimidate political prisoners. After this, in April of 2025, she was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in a penal colony. Her experience as a political prisoner reflects many of the similarities that political prisoners in the past and present have faced. While details of her experience in the penal colony is limited, we can just imagine the psychological pressure, isolation, restricted communication, and punishment that must have taken place during her time spent there. The limited details of her experience are also due to Russia's prisons often restricting reporting or documenting what these prisoners go through. The restriction of reporting allows countries such as Russia to pursue their goal of breaking down these political prisoners and further instills fear onto the people, threatening the safety and forms of resistance that are constantly evolving over time.
Another great case study is of Nasrin Sotoudeh, an Iranian human rights lawyer and political prisoner whose letters from Evin prison, one of Iran's most notorious facilities for political detainees, have become powerful acts of resilience. Her letters show how writing can become a form of resistance, memory, emotional survival. The following 3 letters are examples of this. In her famous collection of published letters, I Miss You, My Dearest, Sotoudeh writes to her children while imprisoned. When speaking to her son Nima, she writes, Hello, my dearest Nima. Writing a letter to you is so very difficult. How do I tell you where I am so you are innocent and too young to comprehend the true meaning of words such as prison, arrest, sentence, trial, and injustice? When speaking to her daughter, Ranev, to my dearest Miravev, my daughter, my pride and joy, my daughter, I hope you never think that I was not thinking of you or that it was my actions that deserved such punishment. Everything I've done is legal and within the framework of the law. It was then that you lovingly caressed my face with your small hands and replied, I know, mommy, I know. It was on that day that I was freed of the nightmare of being judged by my own daughter. In these letters, addressed to her beloved children, Sotoudeh uses her writing to stay connected to them and to her family. These letters also act as historical documents of a mother's political, mental, and emotional struggles endured inside one of Iran's most notorious prisons. While in prison, Sotoudeh also writes publicly. In a 2020 open letter published by Times Magazine for the International Women's Day, she describes lives inside Evin's prison. Currently, I am in the women's ward, which consists of 3 rooms and 40 inmates. Most have been arrested for political reasons. On this day, I'm thinking about the years that have passed, the years that are silenced in captivity, years of protest, bondage, and the walls behind which we are trapped. In these letters, Sotoudeh pleads for peace and fair treatment for the women in prison in Evin prison, many of whom were wrongfully arrested simply for handing out flowers in the subway to the passengers the previous year on International Women's Day while holding up her photo. She fears that their harsh sentences may be linked to their public support for her and calls for the Iranian government to act with peace towards its own people in the world. Sotoudeh's letters reminds us that even in the most controlled and violent spaces, political prisoners still find ways to speak, to resist, and to be remembered. Through her words, she transforms a prison cell into a place of truth and connection. Her writing shows that art is not just expression, it's survival, documentation, and defiance.
Today, I want to highlight the story of Faraj Bey Rakhdar, a Syrian poet whose entire life became a symbol of resistance. Faraj was originally arrested in early 1980s by the Syrian regime and spent nearly 14 years in some of the country's most brutal prisons, including the famous Tanmour prison. These prisons weren't just places of confinement. They were known for systemic torture, psychological breaking, and complete isolation from the outside world. What makes Faraj extraordinary is that he refused to let those conditions silence him. In a place where even a scrap of paper could get you beaten, he continued to write. He memorized full poems in his head because pens were banned. When he finally got access to paper, he used cigarette rolling paper to be able to write down all the things that he was thinking and practicing, writing in microscopic scripts so guards wouldn't find his work. He smuggled poems out through other prisoners who were being released, turning every verse into an act of survival. Faraj said that Poetry was the only space the regime couldn't imprison his mind. And that's why his works became a lifeline, not just for him, but for other prisoners. His words documented the fear, the hope, and the quiet strength inside those cells. After international pressure from many organizations like PEN, he was released in 2000. Today, his poetry still stands as a testimony to how creativity can survive, even in the places assigned to erase you.